Snow fell in slow, breathless silence, veiling the dying light of dusk as the mountains swallowed the horizon. Eleanor Wade walked through it barefoot, her steps unsteady on the frozen earth, her shawl torn and useless against the storm's white breath. She no longer felt the cold. She felt nothing but the weight of being unwanted. Every cabin she had passed that evening had closed its door on her face. Polite words whispered through cracks, then bolts sliding shut. The widow's curse, they called it. Misfortune followed her like smoke. Somewhere behind her, in the valley she had fled, church bells tolled the hour for someone else's supper, someone else's warmth. Her lips trembled as she whispered her late husband's name to the wind. The snow took it, buried it without ceremony. His death in the mine 6 months ago had left her with debt, gossip, and a burned-down cabin courtesy of his creditor's mercy. She had tried to work in town, but every glance, every murmur cut deeper than hunger. "That's her," they'd said. "The one whose man cheated the mine and got himself buried alive." She had learned to bow her head lower each day, until bowing became living. Now, she walked toward the ridge, toward the one place no settler dared go. Smoke rose faintly between the pines up there, dark against the silver sky. They said an Apache lived alone in those woods, a giant who had once hunted soldiers and never spoke English except to curse them. But snow made strange companions of the living and the desperate. Eleanor could no longer tell the difference between fear and need. Her knees buckled halfway up the ridge. The lantern she carried had long gone out, the wick frozen in its glass cage. She knelt, dizzy, her breath small clouds of silver. When she looked up again, a shape moved through the snowfall. Broad shoulders, bare chest beneath an open hide coat, black hair pulled behind his neck. He stood silent, watching her as the wind wove itself between them. "Please," she managed, her voice hoarse and thin. "Sir, may I sleep under your cabin tonight?" Her words trembled as if ashamed to exist. For a long heartbeat, he didn't move. Then he stepped closer, the crunch of his boots loud against the hush. His eyes were dark as melted earth, unreadable, reflecting the small, dying light of her will. He set a lantern on the snow beside her, its flame blooming like mercy in the storm. Then he crouched, took a wool blanket from his shoulder, and wrapped it around her trembling frame without a word. She flinched at the nearness of his skin, scarred, warm, smelling faintly of smoke and pine sap. He didn't speak until her breathing slowed. "Inside," he said finally, his voice low and steady, not a question. Eleanor wanted to refuse. Pride or fear, she wasn't sure which still lingered in her. But her legs no longer obeyed her, and his calm eyes offered no choice except life. He helped her stand, his hand rough and sure at her elbow, guiding her up the narrow path toward a cabin half buried in snow. Its roof was bowed with ice, but firelight flickered through a window like the promise of a heartbeat. Inside, warmth struck her like a revelation. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and broth, the walls lined with hides, the floor swept clean. He shut the door behind them and crossed to the hearth, feeding the fire with quiet precision. No words, only motion. The way he moved spoke of years spent in silence. She stood awkwardly near the threshold, dripping snow onto his floor, the blanket clutched to her chest like a shield. He turned, studying her with a stillness that was not suspicion but patience. She realized he was waiting for her to stop shaking before doing anything more. When she did, he pointed toward a stool near the fire. "Sit." Her voice barely came. You're not afraid of me?" He frowned faintly, puzzled, as if the question itself was nonsense. Then softer. "Cold kills faster than fear." She obeyed. The stool creaked beneath her weight. The heat from the flames licked at her frozen toes. Pain bloomed, sharp and living. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. The man stirred the pot that hung above the fire, then ladled something thick and steaming into a tin bowl. He handed it to her wordlessly. Her hands shook too hard to hold it, so he steadied the bowl with one palm beneath hers until she managed a first sip. The broth was coarse, wild, venison and roots, but to her it tasted like salvation. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. "I'll work for it," she said quickly, ashamed. "Please don't think I mean to steal. I can wash, mend, whatever." He raised a hand, quieting her. Eat first. And so she did, trembling between gratitude and disbelief. When the bowl was empty, she murmured a broken, "Thank you." He nodded once and returned to the fire, sitting cross-legged on the floor. For a long time neither spoke. The only sound was the snow brushing softly against the walls outside. Through half-lidded eyes she studied him. The curve of muscle under his skin, the faint burn scars along his shoulder, the solemn way he stared into the flames as though they might speak. His silence wasn't cruelty, it was reverence. She wondered what he had lost to live this way, so far from any voice but his own. When her shaking lessened, she asked, "Do you have a name, sir?" He looked at her then, not sharply, but with a gravity that made her heart beat slow. "Talon," he said simply. "Grey Wolf." She nodded, whispering, "Eleanor." He inclined his head once, then turned back to the fire. The conversation ended there, but something unspoken settled between them, fragile and solemn as the snow outside. Hours passed. The fire dimmed. Eleanor fought sleep, ashamed to take comfort under another man's roof, especially one who owed her nothing. Yet exhaustion claimed her. When she opened her eyes again, Talon was gone from the cabin. Panic flickered, until she saw him through the small frost-ringed window. He sat outside in the snow, bare shoulders gleaming faintly under the moon, a spear laid across his knees. Watching the night, guarding something he did not name. For her. She lay back down, pulse slow and heavy with gratitude and confusion. No man had looked at her without hunger or judgment since her husband died. Yet this stranger, this supposed savage, had offered warmth and silence instead of words. She listened to the snow fall softer now, the wind settling like breath between two souls who did not yet understand each other. Near dawn, she awoke again to the creak of the door. Talon entered, snow dusting his hair. He set fresh logs in the hearth, then crouched beside her. Without meeting her eyes, he handed her a small tin cup of water. She saw then that his hands were bleeding from the cold. Instinct moved her. She reached for one, her thumb brushing over cracked skin. He didn't pull away, but his gaze lifted to hers, unreadable as a mountain shadow. "I didn't mean to bring trouble," she whispered. His voice came quiet, almost reluctant. "You bring life." The words startled her. Half kindness, half confession. Before she could answer, distant voices echoed through the woods. The rough laughter of men, faint but coming closer. Talon's head turned toward the sound. His face changed. No longer gentle but alert, carved in warning. He rose silently, took his spear, and motioned for her to stay low. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice barely air. He didn't answer. Through the window, she saw 3 lanterns bobbing in the storm below the ridge. Men from town, she realized, searching for her. The same men who had burned her home and chased her through the snow. Shame and fear surged together. She gripped the blanket tighter. Talon moved to the door, standing in its frame like part of the wood itself, silent and immovable. The firelight caught his scars, turning them into copper lines against his skin. He didn't speak to her again, only glanced once over his shoulder, a look that said, "You're safe." She wanted to believe it. But the voices outside grew louder, calling her name. Her name, the sound of her ruin, carried by the wind. She pressed a hand to her mouth and waited, her heart pounding with both terror and something new, a fragile faith in the stranger who had opened his door. The lantern light flickered across the snow, then vanished. The men moved on, their voices fading into the storm. Only then did Talon close the door, sliding the wooden bar into place. He turned, exhaled, and met her eyes across the quiet cabin. Neither spoke. The fire crackled softly, as if the night itself were exhaling with them. When he finally spoke, his words were nearly a whisper. "You stay till snow stops." Eleanor nodded, her voice trembling. "And then?" Talon looked toward the window, where the snow kept falling heavier, endless. "Then we see if the world still wants you gone." Outside, the storm howled again, but inside, something small and human began to thaw. Morning came gray and brittle, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise over the ridge. Smoke curled from the chimney, a thin thread against the white sky. Eleanor woke to the soft hiss of the fire, her body stiff but alive, her shoulder aching where the blanket had stuck to half-frozen skin. For a long moment she lay still, unsure whether the safety around her was real. The cabin walls, lined with hides and old wood, seemed to breathe faintly, alive with warmth, yet haunted by quiet. Talon stood near the hearth, sharpening a knife against a stone. His bare back glowed in the firelight, each movement deliberate, controlled. He had already been awake for hours. His silence filled the room as completely as the smoke. It was not the silence of suspicion, but of a man long unused to words. Eleanor rose slowly, embarrassed by her frailty. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, revealing the tattered dress that clung to her frame. She pulled it tight, feeling the eyes of a stranger though he wasn't looking. The air between them carried the faint scent of pine resin, ash, and the stew he was stirring. "You should eat," he said without turning. She hesitated, then stepped closer. "You've been kind. I don't understand why." He set the knife down. "Storm doesn't ask who it kills." The simplicity of his answer made her throat tighten. She sat on the floor near the fire, palms spread toward its heat, watching her fingers thaw from gray to pink. The silence grew heavier, yet somehow it did not wound. For the first time in months, she wasn't being judged, measured, or whispered about. She was simply allowed to exist. When the wind howled outside, the cabin's boards groaned like old bones. "This place feels like it's lived through ghosts," she murmured. Talon looked up. "It has." He didn't explain, but she saw it in his eyes. The echo of loss, the memory of someone buried under snow or time. Something in her chest recognized it, the way grief recognizes itself in another. Later, while he repaired a cracked beam above the window, she began to tidy what little she could. Folded the pelts, brushed the dust from the table, arranged the wooden bowls in a neat line. He watched without stopping her, though his gaze lingered whenever she passed. It wasn't desire that glimmered there. It was wonder, as though he hadn't seen another soul move gently in his world for years. When she stumbled on a carved toy horse tucked behind a crate, she paused. Its edges were smooth from handling, its paint long faded. "This yours?" Talon's shoulders stiffened. "My son's." She blinked, startled. "You had a family?" He turned away from her, pressing the cracked beam into place. "Long ago. Settlers came. Said they needed land. Fire came with them." Her breath caught. The world seemed to tilt. Her people had been the fire. "I'm sorry," she whispered, knowing it wasn't enough. He nodded once, jaw tight. "You didn't light it." The air between them shifted, heavy with memory. Two ghosts now shared the same room, one in flesh, one in silence. By midday, the snow softened into a drifting lull. Eleanor ventured outside to fetch water, her boots crunching in shallow drifts. The air was clean, sharp with pine. She felt him behind her before she saw him, standing in the doorway, spear in hand, scanning the tree line. Protecting without speaking. She wanted to tell him she wasn't worth guarding, that she had brought ruin to every place she'd known, but the words died on her tongue. When she returned, he was skinning a hare, movements fluid as breath. Blood steamed against the cold. "You shouldn't be out alone," he said quietly. "I was only a few steps away." "Snow hides tracks," he replied. "Men follow what they don't see." She understood then that he meant the riders from the night before. The thought of them made her chest hollow. She knelt near the fire again, watching him cook. The scent of roasted meat filled the cabin, mingling with wood smoke until it felt like a home. They ate in silence, broken only by the crackle of the logs. Afterward, she asked softly, "Do you hate us?" "The settlers." Talon wiped the blade clean. "Hate is heavy. I carry enough." She wanted to say she understood, but she didn't, not fully. Still, his words stayed with her, circling her heart like the wind outside. That night, the storm returned. The wind struck the cabin walls so hard the shutters rattled loose. Talon rose to fix them, pulling the door against the gale. The cold burst inside, swirling snow over the floor. Eleanor jumped, instinctively moving to help. Together they pushed, shoulder to shoulder, until the door sealed again. The sudden closeness startled them both. Her breath brushed his throat. His warmth enveloped her like something forbidden. She stepped back, trembling. Not from fear but from the sudden knowledge that loneliness could ache less when shared. When the wind finally quieted, he lit another lantern. "You should sleep," he said. "And you?" He shook his head. "Someone stays awake." Her gaze dropped to his bleeding knuckles, cracked from the cold. She fetched a strip of cloth from her shawl and held it out. "Let me." He didn't move at first, then slowly extended his hand. She wrapped it carefully, her fingers grazing his skin. Beneath the calluses, his pulse beat strong and steady. Neither spoke. When she finished, he said softly, "You fix what's broken." The words struck deep. She swallowed hard. "So do you." Something shifted then, not in the air but in the quiet rhythm between them. The fire glowed amber against their faces. Her reflection flickered in his eyes, fragile, uncertain, alive. When she finally lay down, she found it impossible to sleep. The cabin creaked with the voice of old wood and memory. She thought of his lost son, of her dead husband, of two people trapped between worlds that no longer wanted them. The thought made her ache with both sorrow and belonging. Just before dawn, a sound outside startled her awake, hoofbeats muffled by snow. She sat up sharply. Talon was already at the window, bow drawn, breath calm. Through the thin gap in the shutter, she saw a figure moving through the trees. A trapper on horseback, leading two others. Lanterns swung from their saddles. "Do they know we're here?" She whispered. "Not yet." "What if they come?" He didn't look away. "Then they find ghosts, not people." The words were neither boast nor threat. They were truth. He lowered the bow slowly, eyes narrowing as the riders turned back down the valley. The sound of their departure faded like a bad dream. Eleanor exhaled shakily. "They're looking for me," she said. "For what I owe." He turned from the window, expression unreadable. "Then they look in wrong place." Her chest tightened. "You'd risk yourself for me?" He paused, studying her as if searching for language strong enough to hold the answer. "I already did." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, of the faint hiss of the fire, of shared breath, of two ghosts beginning to remember what it meant to be alive. Outside, the first pale light of morning crept across the snow, washing the world in silver. Eleanor sat near the window, staring at the horizon where the riders had vanished. The cabin seemed smaller now, yet safer, like a heartbeat hiding under the earth. Behind her, Talon spoke so quietly she almost missed it. "When snow ends, they'll come again." She turned, fear rising. "Then what do we do?" He looked toward the mountains, his profile cut against the firelight. "Then we see who they truly want." The words hung in the air like a prophecy, their meaning unclear but heavy enough to make her shiver. And as the light grew stronger, she realized that the ghosts inside this house were no longer just memories. They were the two of them, waiting to see which one the world would forgive first. The thaw came slow, creeping down from the mountains like mercy unsure of its welcome. Snow still clung to the pines, but water sang beneath the drifts, whispering of the season's turn. In the cabin on the ridge, Eleanor hung a line of damp laundry near the hearth. Talon's shirts, her mended skirts, small signs that two lives had begun to share breath. She worked quietly, careful not to disturb the rhythm of the place. Every motion felt intimate, deliberate. The brush of her sleeve against the table, the scrape of a ladle across the pot. Talon carved a length of cedar by the window, shaping it into a handle for a new knife. The light caught on the planes of his face, on the faint scars that seemed to soften with warmth. He had spoken more these past days than in all the weeks she'd been there, though his words came measured, as if language itself were something fragile. Sometimes, when she laughed softly at his broken English, he would give a ghost of a smile before retreating behind silence again. In the evenings they ate by the fire, two shadows flickering against the walls. She had grown to know his habits, how he'd watch the flames as though speaking to them, how his gaze sometimes drifted to the carved toy horse on the shelf and lingered there until the stew boiled over. She never asked again about his son. She didn't need to. Grief had a way of recognizing its own shape. When she ventured into the valley one morning to fetch flour from an old trader's shack, the air felt different. The town below was stirring again. Tracks in the snow marked wagon wheels and boots. Smoke rose from chimneys like thin gray accusations. She pulled her hood low and kept to the edge of the road, but still she heard it, voices, thin as knives. That widow? The one who vanished. They say she's up there with him. The Apache. God help her soul. Or his. Each word struck her like cold rain. She hurried away, the bag of flour tight against her chest. When she returned to the ridge, she found Talon outside chopping wood, the axe moving through air and snow with effortless rhythm. He looked up as she approached. "Town talk," she said quietly. He paused mid-swing. "Bad? They think I live in sin." He set the axe down, leaning on it. "You live." She almost smiled, but the ache wouldn't lift. "They'll come again, won't they? Men who think they can save me from my own choices." He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded toward the horizon. "Storm coming. They travel only when proud." The wind carried his meaning, a blizzard building in the distance, both of snow and men. That evening, the air grew heavy. Clouds piled thick over the ridge, bruised with gray. Eleanor watched them from the window, while Talon gathered wood inside. The smell of pine filled the cabin, mingling with tension. When he shut the door, the latch clicked like the sound of fate being sealed. "Why don't you go?" she whispered. "You owe me nothing." He turned, the lamplight burning gold across his skin. "And leave Ghost alone in my house?" The words struck deep. She looked down, ashamed by how much she wanted him to stay. As night fell, the wind began its low moan across the valley. The storm rolled in, swallowing the moon. They worked together, sealing shutters, tightening ropes, feeding the fire. When the first gust hit, snow blasted against the windows like fists. The world outside vanished. Hours passed in the strange half-light of the storm. The cabin creaked. The wind wailed through the chimney, sounding almost human. Eleanor sat near the hearth, needle trembling as she mended a tear in Talon's coat. He sat across from her, sharpening his blade slowly, eyes tracing her hands. "You used to sew for him?" he asked quietly. She looked up, startled. "For my husband?" He nodded. "Yes," she said after a pause. "He never thanked me for it." Talon's gaze dropped to the coat between her fingers. "Then he never saw." The fire popped, sending sparks like gold stars into the dark. She smiled faintly, a crack in years of bitterness. "And you, Talon, who saw you?" He met her eyes. "No one left." For a moment, neither could look away. The air between them shimmered with something fragile, dangerous, alive. Then thunder cracked across the ridge, snapping the spell. Outside, the storm intensified, sheets of snow roaring like ocean surf. The cabin trembled. Talon stood, checking the latch again. Through the howl, a faint sound emerged, a horse whinnying. He froze. Eleanor rose too, heart pounding. "Someone's out there," she whispered. He peered through a crack in the shutter. 2 lanterns flickered below the slope, dim but moving closer. "Stay," he said, taking his rifle. "Talon. Stay." He slipped out the door into the white chaos, vanishing within seconds. Eleanor pressed her hands to the window, barely seeing through the swirl. Lightning flashed once, revealing the ridge below. 2 men on horseback, their faces hidden, calling out her name. The sound cut through the storm like a curse. She turned from the window, pacing, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since girlhood. The fire crackled wildly, shadows leaping across the walls. She thought of the gossip, of the words spat by women who never knew hunger. Of men who thought righteousness was ownership. Then, gunfire. 1 shot, then silence. She ran to the door, flung it open. The wind nearly tore it from its hinges. Snow blinded her eyes, stung her cheeks. "Talon!" she cried. The only answer was the storm's scream. Through the blur, a shape emerged. A man dragging another by the collar, limp and half-conscious. Talon stumbled forward, breath hard, snow streaking his skin like war paint. He dropped the intruder in the snow. The man groaned, clutching his arm where the bullet had grazed it. Go! Talon ordered, his voice low, feral. Tell them Ridge is no home for thieves. The man scrambled away, crawling toward the dark. The second rider had already fled. Eleanor stood frozen as Talon turned toward her. Blood ran down his side, a shallow cut glistening against his ribs. She rushed forward, catching his arm. You're hurt. He shook his head. Not much. Inside, she pulled him to the chair by the fire, tearing a strip from her skirt to clean the wound. Her hands trembled, but he didn't flinch. His eyes watched her every motion, the stormlight flashing in their depths. They'll tell the town you tried to kill them, she said, voice shaking. They'll call it proof you're savage. His lips curved faintly. They already believe it. She pressed the cloth harder, tears threatening. Why do you keep saving me? He looked at her then, long and steady. Because you still think you're worth saving. The words silenced her. For a heartbeat, all she heard was the storm outside and the uneven rhythm of their breathing. The cabin glowed with firelight, snow glowing pale through the shutters like ghosts at the windows. When she finished bandaging him, he caught her wrist gently. His hand was rough, warm, trembling slightly. You stay because you choose, he said. Not because I keep door open. Her throat tightened. And if I choose you? His hand released her slowly. Then you see what storm leaves behind. A crack of thunder shook the floor, scattering ashes from the hearth. They both looked toward the window, where the wind howled louder than before. The world outside no longer had shape, just white fury and sound. But inside, between two ghosts who had outlasted too much silence, there was a fragile pulse of something beginning. Hours passed before the storm began to fade. The wind softened to a whisper, snow falling lazy and slow again. Eleanor sat beside Talon, their shoulders nearly touching, both staring into the fire as dawn's first gray light crept across the floor. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say that the storm hadn't already shouted for them. At last, she rose to look outside. The valley below was blanketed smooth and untouched, as if all the world's judgment had been buried. But faint in the distance she saw them, for dark figures on horseback, coming from town, lanterns swaying. The men she feared most. Her breath caught. They're coming back. Talon stood behind her, silent, the fire painting his skin in gold and shadow. Then let them, he said softly. This time, they find more than ghosts. And as the wind began to rise again, carrying their names through the valley, she felt for the first time not fear, but a strange, steady calm, like the eye of the storm itself waiting to be born. The wind sharpened to a blade that morning, slicing through the silence as though the storm itself had found a voice. The snow no longer drifted. It drove sideways, fierce and white, erasing the line between earth and sky. Eleanor stood by the window, watching the horizon blur into ghostly gray. Down in the valley, faint glimmers of torchlight bobbed like restless spirits. They were coming again, as Talon had said they would. The town men, led by Sheriff Macklin, the ones who believed sin burned brighter than mercy. Talon moved with calm purpose, gathering what little he owned. He checked his rifle, though his eyes were on her, not the weapon. You can still go, he said quietly. They'll take you back if you step outside before they see me. Eleanor turned from the window. And leave you to face them alone? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence was an old language she'd learned to read. Every breath, every look, every pause carried meaning deeper than words. She walked closer, the air between them charged with everything unspoken. You gave me life when no one else would open a door, she said softly. If they want to take that from me, they'll have to take me too. His jaw tightened, but there was no surprise in his eyes, only acceptance. Then we don't hide, he murmured. We stand. He stepped outside first, bare-chested beneath his buffalo hide coat, the cold biting into his skin like penance. The snow swirled around him, a storm circling its own center. Eleanor followed, clutching the wool around her shoulders, her hair whipped by wind. Below them, figures emerged from the white. 5 men on horseback, torches in one hand, rifles in the other. Sheriff Macklin. Talon called out, his voice cutting through the gale. You come for blood, You'll find it's not yours to take. The sheriff's horse reared, unsettled by the cold and the man's calm defiance. Macklin's face was hidden beneath a fur hat, his breath a ghost in the air. "We came for the woman," he shouted. "No Apache keeps a Christian wife. Step aside, savage, and you might see another sunrise." Eleanor moved to stand beside Talon, trembling but firm. "I'm not your concern," she cried. "You left me to die." "She's bewitched," one of the men yelled. "Look at her, defending him." Talon's hand brushed her arm, a gesture both steadying and wordless. He spoke to the men again, his tone even. "Go home. The snow is hungry tonight." But the storm was louder than reason. A torch arced through the air, tumbling end over end before striking the cabin wall. Fire leapt to life, licking the wood with eager tongues. Eleanor gasped, rushing toward it, but Talon caught her wrist. "Stay," he commanded. He strode forward into the storm, boots cracking over ice, his size towering against the blur of white. He picked up the burning torch and crushed it in his bare hands, snow sizzling where flame met flesh. The men hesitated. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a rifle cracked. The sound shattered the sky. Eleanor screamed. Talon staggered but did not fall. The bullet had grazed his side, blood blooming dark against the snow. He turned toward the shooter, young, terrified, already lowering his weapon. "Go," Talon said, voice low, steady. "Go before the storm takes your breath." The men faltered, caught between fear and fury. Macklin raised his arm to order another shot, but before he could speak, the wind roared with sudden violence. Snow erupted around them, blinding, suffocating. The torches died one by one. Horses screamed. The blizzard came down like divine judgment. Eleanor ran to Talon, grabbing his arm. "Inside!" she shouted over the wind. Together they stumbled back into the cabin, the door slamming behind them. Smoke curled from the wall where fire still smoldered. She tore a blanket from the cot, beating the flame until it died. The air filled with the scent of charred wood and sweat and fear. Talon sank to his knees by the hearth, breath ragged, blood seeping through his side. She dropped beside him, pressing a cloth to the wound. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice breaking. "It missed," he muttered, though his lips had turned pale. Her hands shook as she worked, tears blurring her sight. "Why won't they leave us alone? We've done nothing." "They see what they fear," he whispered. "A man who doesn't kneel. A woman who doesn't break." The words silenced her. She realized then that everything he'd done, taking her in, facing the riders, even bleeding for her, wasn't about love alone. It was about defiance against a world that punished the gentle for surviving. The storm raged for hours. The roof creaked under its weight, the windows rattled like bones. Eleanor stayed beside him, holding pressure on his wound until her arms trembled. He drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering in Apache, a prayer, perhaps, or a memory. Each time he stirred, she soothed him with a hand to his hair, whispering, "You're safe. You're safe." When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed. The valley below lay buried in silence, the men gone, their torches extinguished and tracks erased by snow. Smoke rose from the hearth. The world felt newly made, clean and empty. Eleanor knelt beside Talon, brushing frost from his brow. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then clear. "They're gone," she said, smiling through tears. He exhaled, long and low. "Good." She helped him sit up, her arm around his shoulders. Outside, the snow glowed faintly under morning light, no longer cruel but soft, forgiving. The cabin stood scarred but whole, like them. "You should rest," she said. He looked at her, a faint curve touching his mouth. "You stay here now?" Her heart stuttered. "Here?" He nodded once. "No more under cabin. You sleep beside fire." The words carried the weight of a vow, though neither dared name it. She pressed her forehead to his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his skin, the steady beat beneath. The room felt sacred, the kind of silence found in church pews or at gravesides, where love and loss lived together. Days passed. The wound healed slowly. She tended him with quiet devotion, feeding the fire, mending the roof, singing softly when he slept. The gossip below the ridge died with the storm. Those who'd come for her never returned. And when spring came at last, green began to bleed through the white, cautious and alive. One evening, as the last snow melted from the pines, she stood outside the cabin, staring at the valley bathed in golden light. The world looked kinder than it ever had. Behind her, Talon stepped onto the porch, shirtless still, scars catching the sunset. "You look like peace," he said. She turned, smiling. "You sound like one." He approached, his hand brushing her cheek, fingers rough and reverent. "You still afraid?" "Of what?" "The world," he said simply. She thought for a moment, then shook her head. "No. Only of forgetting this." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Then don't." The words were a promise, unwritten, eternal. She closed her eyes, letting his touch anchor her to this moment, this life she never thought she'd earn. The last rays of sun slipped behind the ridge, painting the snow gold. Below them, the town lights flickered to life, faint and far away. Maybe they still whispered her name with scorn, but it no longer mattered. She had found her home in the quiet between storms. As dusk deepened, she whispered, "What will they say about us now?" Talon looked toward the valley, then back to her. "They'll say two ghosts built a fire where none should burn." And as the night gathered around them, the fire inside the cabin glowed steady, its light reaching the snow outside, proof that even in the coldest world, something human could still burn bright enough to be seen.